So we had our interview with Nigel Farage yesterday, which was interesting, wasn't it, Kamal? In that he discussed US politics, and we put that into yesterday's Daily Tea, and he talks about domestic politics in this part that we're going to feature in this episode. Now, I noted that in the photographs accompanying our Daily Tea, you didn't look particularly cheerful.
I do find Nigel Farage difficult to navigate, and we're
Yes.
going to get into that after the interview. How do you and me analyse what he's all about? And some parts of Nigel Farage, let me say this carefully, make me feel a little uncomfortable.
OK, we will be discussing that later. So, who unites the right? And is Nigel Farage fit to be PM? Are the questions we're going to be answering, Kamal. Welcome to today's Daily Tea with me, Camilla
And me, Kamal Ahmed.
So, Kamal, we asked Nigel Farage to come on primarily to discuss Biden dropping out of the race. The point was yesterday, we wanted to discuss US politics. We wanted to talk about Harris, Biden and Trump. Who best to talk about the latter with? Nigel Farage. So we invited him into the Daily Tea studio. You never quite know when you invite politicians in how much time they've got. And then it sort of turned into something we didn't really realise it would, because we started talking about the US and then he didn't really seem in a rush to leave. And so then we got into conversations about domestic politics, his comments about the riots in Leeds and lots of other subjects, Kamal. So let's just let you listen to it. You're not afraid of expressing an opinion. Like even last week in relation to the Leeds riots, you tweeted this comment. The politics of the subcontinent are currently playing out on the streets of Leeds, you said on X. Don't say I didn't warn you. And then
it's been happening everywhere.
Yeah, but there was a backlash against that specifically, just because I wrote about it in my column this week. So I looked into the demographics, and I know that area because I studied law at Leeds University back in the 18th century. And actually what that was, when you looked at it, it was a domestic incident that went completely out of control. There were people of all ethnicities basically just engaging in group thuggery because they could. The police were in retreat. The next thing we know, we got somebody setting fire to a bus. It wasn't really race-related.
Well, it was on the same evening in the East End of London, where it was directly linked to events in Bangladesh. That particular incident, you're right, there was a Roma spark. But I mean, go to Page Hall in Leeds. I mean, see what David Blunkett said about it 10 years ago. You know, the argument here is a very simple argument that if you get your immigration policies wrong, you finish up not just with divided communities, but with large groupings of people with completely different sets of priorities. And that extends now, of course, into sectarian voting. I'd never seen sectarian voting in my lifetime, not in England anyway. So these things are all very dangerous and very bad.
When you talk about culture of the subcontinent, I just wondered what you meant.
The racist hatreds between the different tribes and religions. But let's be honest about it. Oh, my God, aren't we awful in this kind of... I remember interviewing Cyrus Todawali, guy that came here from India, became an acclaimed curry chef. He's now got a curry school teaching people how to cook curries. I mean, a very distinguished bloke. And I was interviewing him a couple of years back, and I said, well, you know, when you came here in the 70s, did you experience racism? He said, racism? You want to go and live in India? You know, that's the point I was making, that there are these terrible tensions on the subcontinent between different groups.
And now you're an elected member of parliament. Do you think that was the time to make that point? Would it have been better to think, how do we help bring groups together and not maybe seen as condemning groups for where they may come from?
Well, you cannot solve a problem until you first identify what it is. And we have a growing problem in this country, in many of our cities, in many of our towns, particularly in the northwest and Yorkshire, where the centres of towns are frankly unrecognisable. You wouldn't even know you're in England.
How's it been being in Parliament?
It's been good. I've had a great reception from the security detail and people working for the House, and lots of selfies.
Your fellow parliamentarians?
Too bad. Actually, not too
Reform
bad.
Being a bit squeezed out? We heard reports last week of you couldn't get any seats in the chamber, and you're sort of, being squeezed between Liberal Democrats.
It'll all work. It'll all work itself out. I mean, I surely can't be as outnumbered there as I was in Brussels.
No, true. And what do you plan to do for the Trump campaign next? I mean, obviously you went to Milwaukee for a couple of days, but you're now need to be committed to Clacton. You had plans to obviously help him out quite a lot on the campaign trail. What will you now do in the run-up to November the 5th?
Yeah, well, obviously much less. I've got three priorities, three political priorities. One, which is obviously to get things organised in Clacton and get cracking, because being an MP is a very different experience to being an MEP. As an MEP, you dealt with issues. As an MP, you're dealing much more with individuals. I sensed that the first morning, actually. I was an MEP for a vast region, and I thought, well, I'm only here to represent those that voted for me. And I was, under that system. Whereas as an MP, it's a very different feeling that actually you have a responsibility. So I've got to get things up and running. I'm trying to get office leases, find staff you can trust, that kind of thing. So that's priority one. Priority two is to try and be effective in Parliament. And that doesn't mean speaking all the time. It means speaking when you've got something to really say. And priority three, which is the big one, in the sense that it's the hardest of the three, is to build a political party, to build a national network. Reform was a concept. It didn't have branches. It didn't have deep roots. It was just an idea that stood for something. And now, what I've got to try and turn it into is a national political party, that is capable of putting up thousands of candidates, good candidates for local elections, etc. So that, they are my three main jobs, and that means. So I was going to be in Nashville this weekend. I was going to go to the Bitcoin conference there. I won't be going. I've got a couple of things in my diary between now and Christmas that I simply can't cancel because I pre-booked them a year ago. But no, my participation will be quite low.
And on the reform front, I mean, have you got enough money to sort of professionalise the outfit? Have donations come pouring in, or is this going to be quite the challenge over the next 4 to 5 years? So
we passed 70,000 members yesterday, and that's 25 quid a go. That's way more than UKIP ever had. UKIP was high 40s, 48, 49 was the highest UKIP ever got to. So we're at 70,000. We just booked our conference this morning. The UKIP membership tended to be quite old. Not all, but it tended to be quite old. This is very different. It's a very different membership. It's a very different group of people. And I think in terms of getting activists, in terms of finding candidates, in terms of raising money, I think we're in a good place. I think all this speculation about who the next leader of the Conservative Party is, it's almost irrelevant, because the brand's damaged. The brand is very seriously damaged, far more than they realise, actually, and that damage will persist for many, many years to come. So I think we've got a very big opportunity. But look, there's a lot to get right.
But you did say during the election campaign, you wanted to be in a position to campaign to be the next Prime Minister in 2029. And is that credible? Because your vote share was 14% in the end. I know we can have another debate about first past the post versus proportional representation and how 4 million votes for reform didn't translate into the seats as it did for the Liberal Democrats. But that vote share, for you to be anywhere near power, needs to start with a 3, not a 1, right?
Of course.
And how does that happen?
Of course. And I think, to be honest with you, I mean, it's done now, it's over. But I think, to be honest with you, there were some pretty catastrophic failures in terms of candidates we had. And I didn't quite know what I was picking up and running with, to be honest. And that damaged us. And that did hurt us by a few percent. Of course it did. Of course it did. But you know what? We've come out of it. Yeah, some collateral damage around the edges, but we've come out of it with a base in Parliament. We've come out of it with a reasonable vote share. And I've just turned 60, right? I would not have pretty much given most of my life up to come back to this if I didn't think there was a future in it. I could have just slowly, gracefully gone away and retired. No, I think we can really do. I think UKIP was a transformative political party. I can't think of a more successful party in the history of British politics. We set out to achieve a specific policy goal, and we achieved it. This is obviously much bigger, much broader, and more ambitious. But no, I think we've got a chance of becoming a very, very powerful political party within the next 3 or 4 years.
Now, Mr. Farage, you're a former deal maker. Do you imagine that this is done as some form of reverse takeover of at least some of the Conservative Party and its structures, if they agree with reform and maybe your leadership, rather than you just growing and battling with the Conservatives as well as with any other parties?
Well, for the moment, whenever I get asked the question, who do I want to be the next Conservative leader, I couldn't care less. I'm really not interested. As I say, I think it'll make little difference in the short term. When I set up the Brexit Party, because of the mess Mrs May had made of Brexit and just it wasn't going to happen. When I set the Brexit Party up, again, that was set up for a job, and we were the catalyst, I think. Well, I mean, Boris Johnson wouldn't have been PM if we hadn't done what we did. When I rebranded it Reform, and then sort of quietly walked away to be sort of honorary chairman and let Richard Tice do all the hard work, I did it thinking about Canada. I did it thinking about what Preston Manning set up in the 1980s in Canada. Now, it took him a few elections. His first election, general election, was comparable perhaps to what we've just done in this election. And then in the next election, they become bigger than the official Conservative Party. And then as a few years go by, they become the government. And Mr. Harper, who was the Canadian Prime Minister, and quite widely respected Prime Minister actually, was first elected as a Reform MP. So the answer to your question is, we will be the catalyst this time for a complete reorienting of the centre-right of British politics. Exactly what form that takes or shape that takes years down the road, I think it's impossible for us to sit here and say, but I do believe it can be done, and I do believe that it will be done.
Finally, is there an argument, though, for moderating a little bit in terms of that 14% vote share is on the back of a series of different circumstances, Tory infighting not witnessed in recent decades, and a total collapse, the back of Trussonomics, a string of broken promises by the Conservatives, people feeling politically homeless, the backdrop of COVID, the war in Ukraine and everything else, then presents this result for Reform, which no one can take away from you. It is a phenomenal result for the party, not least because it's in its fledgling era. Having said that, to grow from 14% to anything with a 3 in front of it might require you to moderate your position.
Oh, you've spent too much time in Westminster, Camilla.
I might have spent too much time with Kamal.
Yeah, you want to get out more, guys. You want to get out.
Do you reckon?
You
but,
do.
But you grow it from what? A youth following? Where do
well, the
you
youth
target?
thing is the youth thing is really interesting. I mean, something very big is happening. Gen Z are completely different to the millennials. The millennials talk about work-life balance and all this sort of thing, whereas a large chunk of Gen Z want to get on. They want to get on. They want to, they want good jobs. They want to buy houses. They want to do stuff that their parents and grandparents were able to do. They're quite frustrated, actually, that in many cases it appears to be beyond their fingertips to achieve those things. And if you look at the social media following, that I've developed and built over the last few years, I mean, it's pretty big now.
Yeah.
It's genuine. It's about 5 million followers across the platforms. It is big. Now, it's one thing to have a celebrity status with this age group. I mean, 16, 17-year-olds, I mean, it's unbelievable. Despite what their teachers are telling them, it's unbelievable.
You'll be advocating for them to vote next.
No, even though it might be to my advantage. But you then have to turn that into votes, and that's the process that we have to go through to make that work. But no, Camilla, I'd say this to you. We're after Labour votes now.
Yeah.
I think the early stages of a party like ours, it was disaffected Conservatives. I think as time goes by, it's the Labour vote we'll be after. And it's interesting, I mean, even Tony Blair saying, Labour must think about reform. So I think you'll be surprised. I think the old left-right divides in politics are breaking down and changing.
Great.
Brilliant stuff. Nigel Farage, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea to discuss Biden, Harris, Trump, and much, much more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the thing about Nigel Farage, Camilla. He is right about a lot of things. He picks up on many people's frustration that systems don't work for them. They haven't got a good service. There's lots of inequality. Public services don't work well enough. And he's also right about the threat to Labour. First, a column I wrote just before the election was that the first thing and this was Labour, senior Labour people talking to me, that they needed to be thoughtful about was, what does the Reform vote mean? Those 4 million people who voted for Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, that is a significant political threat to Labour. And if Labour don't get the reforms right, they are going to struggle. So he has something. There is something there. But here's the problem with Farage for someone like me, and why I said he makes me uncomfortable. His analysis is often important to listen to, and that's why it's important that we interview him, however we may feel about some of the broader issues that he may raise. But the solutions he puts in place are really problematic. And if we look at the issue of Hare Hills and the violence we saw there, the fires, the overturning of the police car, the bus that we referred to in his interview, in those situations, he uses language which I don't think is the type of language that politicians should use who are looking for solutions and bringing people together, not exacerbating division. And it wasn't only him saying the politics of the subcontinent are currently playing out on the streets of Leeds, which is not correct, as you pointed out, but also Lee Anderson, one of the Reform MPs, he doubled down on that and said that what was happening in places like Hare Hills, he said, import a third world culture and you get third world behaviour. I want my country back. And it's that tone that becomes a real problem in what is Lee Anderson trying to achieve by messages like that.
But also, it debases Farage because he jumped on the bandwagon and he tweeted without thinking. And also, actually, I know they're in the same party. He doesn't really want to be associated with Lee Anderson because I would suggest, as kindly as I can, that Lee Anderson is more cerebrally challenged than Nigel Farage. OK? That's a fact. The thing about Farage is he is quite clever and he is a good communicator. And he does at least open up debates. But the answers to the questions he raises are arguably not the right ones. From a sort of righty perspective on Farage, I mean, I don't mind being photographed with him down in the newsroom to promote the podcast and to promote the piece. Weirdly, I get it from both angles because I'll get righties who are like, oh, you're associating with Farage, and then I'll get reformers questioning why I'm not more supportive of reform. And it's like, my God, what kind of right... What do you want me to be here? I mean, I'm just basically a Thatcherite. But anyway, we'll get onto that in a minute because we're going to be talking about the Tory leadership candidates. So for a sort of caucus of people like me, small c conservatives, I quite like the idea of Farage just opening up debates. I have grown sick and tired, like a lot of people on the right. And again, maybe we should talk about being branded right or not. We cannot have a situation in this country where if somebody like me in a perfectly moderate manner says, do you know what? We're not going to be able to sort out the housing crisis until we get a grip on legal migration. Or, do you know what? This issue with people coming here by boat needs to stop fundamentally because we're seeing women and children drowning in the Channel, and have a whole group of people on the left point at us and go, you're a bigot and a racist. That does not advance the argument. My problem with Farage in a leadership or prime ministerial role is Farage doesn't make me feel good about being on the right. Okay? In the same way that Jeremy Corbyn is uncomfortable for lefties, there's a role for Jeremy Corbyn and there's a role for Nigel Farage. But their answers to questions, in the same way that you're criticising Farage because he seems to be blaming everything on immigrants. You know, I looked at Corbyn and he seemed to be blaming everything on American elites and possibly Jewish people. And I found that deeply uncomfortable because my stepmother's Jewish and so are a load of my friends. So we all come from this from our own personal experience. You feel that he's a bit 80s, he's a bit sort of Courvoisier drinking, got some pretty old-fashioned thoughts.
I don't actually. I I get some of the whiff of, I wouldn't say 80s, probably 70s. I get some of that. I just wish, my one plea to Mr. Farage, and I've met him quite a few times, and we had him here yesterday, and he's good at, as you say, communicating. He does have a discussion. He has his argument. My one plea to him is please just base what you're saying on the facts. Let's just go back to Hare Hills. I read the Yorkshire Post coverage of what happened there. And the Yorkshire Post said, Thursday night's events were accompanied by commentary dripping with prejudice on the petri dish of hatred that is social media, without a clue about the issues.
Yeah.
And the whole point that you make is that when you talk about issues like this around violence, around how do we help communities not be affected by such unpleasant events that we saw, please stick to what happened. There is no evidence that this was anything to do with the politics of the subcontinent. And then again, just reading the reporting on what happened in Hare Hills, who was one of the most important figures on that night stopping the violence escalating? It was Mothin Ali, the Green Party councillor for Gipton and Hare Hills. He was the person who got home at 3 o'clock on that Friday morning after trying to stop people from throwing objects and adding to the already intense situation. What I think Mr. Farage needs to discover in his mind and in his politics, if he is truly serious about being Prime Minister of this country by 2029, he must praise and identify what who is actually helping in situations, rather than lumping groups of people together and being divisive, but being divisive on untruths.
The thing that worried me about the riots, and I wrote about it in the column as I referred to in that interview, the thing that disturbed me most, just speaking into the broken Britain narrative for a second, is how we had this situation where it started with a small domestic dispute. People then sort of piled in on that. The next thing, we've got people from all walks of life sort of jumping on this criminal bandwagon. And I just thought it was depressing to see the public, when the police were in retreat, as soon as the police car started getting rocked, the officers said, Jesus, we're outnumbered here. Something depressing about mob rule taking over, the police in retreat, a lack of respect for the police, young people filming the police being humiliated on their phones. That really offends my sort of natural sense of fairness and justice. And I mean, I do quite like law and order, Kamal. Call me old-fashioned.
And also, you imagine the fear that engendered in the local community. If you were a young person, if you were watching that happening on your streets. I just think to move on around this idea of the leadership of the right, beyond how Nigel Farage uses the day-to-day to make points which are divisive rather than offer solutions, he needs to also think, I suppose I'm giving two pleas to Nigel Farage, which he may or may not listen to. First of all is base your arguments on the facts, not on what you imagine they might be to help your narrative. The second thing, you have to come up with policy solutions. He does have this idea about immigration, should be stopped, one in, one out. We've discussed on this podcast, we have a falling birth rate, we have a lack of skills, we have business demands. He made during the election campaign huge offers on tax cuts which were unfunded. The market will respond to those things very, very negatively. So he needs to do a lot more work on what his policy proposals are. To be fair, he did say to us as we were chatting, up and down the stairs and in and out of the office as we were talking, and he does talk, and it's very good of him to do that. He said he does have a lot of work to do, sort of intellectual work to do.
Farage is a campaigner who can't seem to deliver. It's like, great, you're great at coming up with the ideas. We look at the manifesto stroke contract with the people and we say, is any of this workable? Put it into practice. And then the Conservatives are complaining about the rise of reform. But if you'd actually delivered what you had promised, you wouldn't be in this mess. Farage has absolutely capitalised and cashed in on a string of broken Conservative promises. Like I was thinking before here, which righties sort of made me feel comfortable? In a way, Boris Johnson made me feel comfortable to be a righty because he had liberal views and everything was quite nuanced. And he certainly didn't do dog whistle, but then he completely fell down on the competence scale. So then you're thinking, God, we're going to get on to discussing the potential candidates and all the rest of it. But all we're really looking for here, this whole conversation, it's always a conversation about, we can't lurch to the right. Nobody ever talks about lurching to the left. Nobody needs to be lurching anywhere. Can you please come up with a solidly conservative manifesto of actual workable policy? And can you please just deliver it? That's all that was needed.
So that is your question, Camilla, then, to who should lead the Conservatives. So why don't we move on to that? Because I think you're right that Farage is filling a hole that the Conservatives have created.
Yeah.
And that is the key to the future of the right. So let's get on to who could help fill that hole if it's not Nigel Farage. Now, Camilla, you have been striding around the office today with a Telegraph, of course. We all read the Telegraph all the time. And on it are such complicated scribbles and hieroglyphs, which I've been surreptitiously trying to read. I sit next to you in the office, but I can't really decipher them. What are all those notes about? Because I think they are about the next leader of the Conservative Party.
They are. They are my notes from chats with Tories on the way into work. And quite typically, most reporters don't have a pen. I do a double whammy. I don't have a pen and I don't have a notebook either. So I got out my Telegraph that was delivered to me this morning and started making notes on it, just on the back of conversations about this critical 1922 committee meeting that is set out this timetable now for the Tory leadership. So the 1922, to the uninitiated, is the backbench committee that sort of sets the rules on leadership. You may remember Sir Graham Brady, the former chairman, is the man in charge of the no confidence letters that were submitted to Boris Johnson.
He had magnificently good teeth, Graham Brady. I seem to
Great
remember.
teeth, great hair.
Teeth. Yeah, really nice hair.
A little bit like Gary South, who we interviewed yesterday. And
actually, could you, Camilla, whilst we get onto that, could you hold it up?
Yes, have a look at that.
For those of you, I need to sort of describe this obviously to our audio listeners, but people on YouTube will see the Daily Telegraph there. There's Kamala Harris, but all over is all of Camilla's scribbles.
And the one thing that I have underlined is universal raspberry blown. Let me explain that. So they have this 22 committee meeting. It's full of backbenchers to decide how this leadership race is going to pan out. And there's two different sort of opinions being voiced. One is, I would say, in the Rishi camp, which is we need to expedite this process. We need to get the leadership bid going. We need to conclude it all by September and then have a coronation at conference. The other camp, which I would say is represented more by the grey hairs, Ian Duncan Smith, David Davis and those types. We love them. They're friends of the Daily Tea. They know what they're talking about, Kamal. They've been there. And they have...
I would smile in a photo with them, that's for sure.
Well, thank you for confirming. And so they're the ones saying, no, hang on, cool your jets. This needs to be a really carefully thought out process. We can't have a beauty pageant at conference. We need to just have conference, have the intellectual arguments about conservatism, and then unveil the future leader. This row went on. You've got the board in the middle of it going, and indeed input from Conservative Party headquarters saying we don't have any money, we can't get the donations in until we've got the leader, so we're in this awful chicken and egg situation. Now, the universal raspberry was blown at the notion that it was perhaps suggested that Sunak is in a bit of it was perhaps suggested by some that Sunak was in a bit of a hurry to get out of this interim leadership role.
For our audio listeners, Camilla is doing the winding up signal.
I'm also like doing a little facial grimace, like how do I explain this? Because to be fair, this is just the chat and I don't quite know. So let's just caveat this a bit. There's always been this suggestion, hasn't there, Kamal, that this bloke is absolutely desperate to, get back out to California, use that green card he's had in the back of his passport wallet for some time, that his wife, Akshata, hasn't really been happy with the way that she's been received, not least because of all of the coverage of her non-dom status. Is there some timing around September and thinking about schools in a parental way for their two daughters? And there's just been the faint whiff of Silicon Valley in the background of any
Is
conversation.
he going to run off? I will bet my light knit top
My God.
that he will stay.
Right.
And also, it's like Rachel Reeves on tax. If Rishi Sunak lets us down when he said he would serve his constituents for the Parliament, it's the same as Rachel Reeves letting people down if she raises people's taxes. I'm making two big bets that those are two decent people and they won't do either. But anyway, let's keep on the Tories for now.
Bless your
I know, I'm so
childish
naive.
faith in
My
politicians.
childish faith.
What are you
I
thinking?
believe in politics as a liberal.
I love that, but
Anyway, sorry.
I think
Yes.
the general thinking in some parts of what's left of the Conservative Party is that come next
Kamal
Easter,
Ahmed might be a little naive.
we won't see him for the dust trail left by his private jet.
He's also got to. He's got to also auction off that.
Yeah, he needs to
suit.
do that with us.
Yes, he's
We
doing
need
that
to
with
do an
us.
event.
Yes,
I
reminder
know,
to the
be fair,
Conservatives who are listening: don't forget that.
That's on the to-do list because you
It
did
is.
tell me to contact him and say, can we auction the suit? And I've just forgotten.
I have messaged his office about it, so let's
All right,
keep
well done.
tabs on that. Anyway, carry on, Camilla.
So point is
Is he going to rush off?
he going to rush off? And then the universal raspberry was blown at this idea that anyone should be doing anything to accommodate Rishi Sunak and his people right now because you got us into this mess. You've got to own it for as long as we need you to. What's going to happen is the candidacy process now opens.
Tomorrow, in fact. Yes.
Tomorrow, there's 12 days for people to put their names into the hat. And then what will happen is there's an argument going on, should people be campaigning in the summer or not? Does it look a bit inappropriate? Just go away for a month, have a think.
Give us all a break.
Give us all a break from your Toryism and your failed promises, and then come back in September and regroup. And on candidates, I mean, should we go through quickly some of the runners and riders? There's a bit of a dialogue about whether Mel Stride should be in there. Are you familiar with Mel Stride?
I am familiar
Yes.
with Mel Stride because when he was work and pensions, I interviewed him a few times when I was
Yeah.
economics editor at the BBC, and a very nice chap he was.
Lovely chap. He did the
Oh,
book.
it is, not past tense. Sorry, Mel, if you're
Yeah.
listening. Or Mr. Stride, sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Stride to
Mr.
you,
Stride.
Kamal, because you're so obedient and polite to our guests. But also, to be fair to Mel Stride, he did a lot of heavy lifting during the election campaign. My goodness me, he was on the broadcast round literally every other day. That's the other argument, by the way. When they have this discussion about what should happen to conservatism and where did we go wrong, it can't just focus on the election campaign. That only tells a tenth of the story. We need to be reflecting on the whole last 14 years. Little bit of insider intel for you, Kamal. The person who is going to be leading that thinking and who everyone is feeding into, so this is Tories who lost their seat, Rees-Mogg, Grant Shapps, Lucy Fraser, all those Tory big beasts that were felled, along with current Tories and other kind of thought leaders in the Conservative space. The person who's leading that thinking and putting a document together apparently is Michael Forsyth, Lord Forsyth, who is the chairman of the Association of British Conservative Peers.
Former Scottish secretary, and was someone who was always seen as a strong Thatcherite voice in the Conservative Party through the 90s and early 2000s.
Can we get away from... You're a person that argues they've got to win this from the centre ground. Can I challenge that a little bit? Why are we going on about the centre ground? What is the centre ground anymore? Should we start talking about the common ground?
Could I just say what Suella Braverman has described the centre ground as?
OK, go on.
A collection of fanatical, irrelevant, centrist cranks. I don't know if she was describing me probably quite precisely from your point of view,
Probably,
Camilla,
yeah.
but all I would say, OK, I did, because I wrote a column, as some people will remember, which said that if Nigel Farage is the answer, you're asking the wrong question. And I did say from
Went
the
down
centre...
really well with readers,
really
that
well,
one.
Went down
Whisper
really well
it.
with everyone. I stand by every word of that
Yep.
column, unlike some other columns we could mention. But anyway, just to move on.
I stand by that column, just not the headline. Stop bringing it up.
I think you are right to say that we need to think about a different language. And I like the idea of, what was it, the common...
I said common ground, not centre ground.
And I think that is right, because the centre ground has been debased by the idea it's sort of the mushy middle, you don't really get solutions from there. But we had George Freeman, the former science minister, on our podcast on the day of the King's speech when we were at College Green down in Westminster. And he came and spoke to us. And he said the sentence which I believe should be the North Star for the Conservatives during this period of hopefully self-reflection, which is people just want delivery, values, integrity, standards and public service.
Amen.
They want things that work. They don't actually want the government, frankly, too much in their face.
No, leave me alone. Leave me alone.
Just make sure my school functions well for my kids. The NHS is there for when I need it, free at the point of use. That the economy means that if I work hard and play by the rules, at the end of the year, I'm slightly richer than I was at the beginning of the year. I can look after my family, and that Britain, the United Kingdom, is a country which is comfortable, is not descending into riots and battles, and is based around an idea of we all get along together and we bring people together. And I thought what George Freeman was saying is what I probably mean by centre, but you're right, Camilla. We shouldn't use that phraseology anymore, because when I wrote that column about Nigel Farage, I got a lot of aggression back to me, which we did reflect on in the podcast, saying, oh, you centrists, it's terrible. So now that has been sort of lost, I think this common values idea could be the thing to do.
Yeah, and also that speaks into me saying that Conservatives have to go back to improving people's lot. One of the most damaging surveys was, do you feel better 14 years on from a Conservative government? Most people are saying no. Then you failed, Tories. Regroup, rethink. Just because I was asking about this New Statesman, because sometimes you just get like, who's the person that the party is gravitated towards? And clearly in this case, it's probably Starmer and Reeves. The Spectator Party, the person that people wanted to get the FaceTime with was Kemi Badenoch. And bear in mind, there were other leadership candidates there. So Robert Jenrick was there. James Cleverly was there. Tom Tugendhat was there. Priti Patel was there. Liz Truss was there. I'm just mentioning that again because I found it quite astonishing. Who else is in this thing? Let me just look at this list because we've got readers. Incidentally, you seem to think that the next Tory leader should be Tom Tugendhat. When I say you, I don't mean you, Kamal. I mean the people who have taken part in this poll on the website. Tom Tugendhat, 23%.
Camilla's doing, just for our audio listeners, Camilla's doing her disgusted of Hertfordshire face.
You know I've got a thing about him because he serves Earl Grey as a default, and that needs to change. Nobody can be Prime Minister of this country who serves Earl Grey as a default. I'd just like to say that now.
Who do you think the four names are going to be?
Definitely Badenoch. Probably Jenrick. Tugendhat. Now, I tell you who the dark horse in this is. Suella's blown herself up. She is not going to get the support of MPs to get into the final four. So take her out of the equation. I think there are doubts over James Cleverly living up to his name. Priti Patel is the dark horse. Well, that's what I'm not saying that. That's what people are saying about the former Home Secretary. Priti Patel is the dark horse here because Suella Braverman has made her look more moderate. And I had a conversation with Robert Buckland at the weekend, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, that he is a very kind of one nation Tory voice. And he's saying, you know, I could see Priti doing good things because he's very complimentary about her at the Home Office. And he worked with her because he was Justice Secretary. And I just thought it was interesting to hear somebody who some might suggest is a bit of a lefty in the Tory party supporting Priti Patel as a righty. But there's this sense to which she is a doer, but obviously then the bullying allegations are held above her head. I mean, I think my money's on Badenoch. Her performance in the House last week against Angela Rayner was really quite impressive. I don't know if you saw it, but basically she just took apart the kind of first week or two of what Labour have proposed, said how she would be robust in opposition, said how unfortunate it was that Angela Rayner had lost her whole brief on new workers to Jonathan Reynolds, because unfortunately this isn't a party that embraces proper socialists or indeed women. She ran rings around and the Labour front bench are going, oh my God. I tell you what, if I was Keir Starmer, out of all of those candidates, who would I fear the most? Badenoch.